The marriage certificate was worthless, just a piece of paper with fancy calligraphy that meant absolutely nothing in the eyes of the law. David Martinez stared at the legal document in his trembling hands, the words of his attorney echoing in his mind like a death sentence. "I'm sorry, David, but this ceremony you went through in Thailand, it has no legal standing whatsoever. Your assets, your house, your retirement fund, they're all gone." How does a man in his 50s, successful, educated, with decades of life experience, fall into such a devastating trap? How does someone who built a consulting business from scratch, who raised two children, who thought he understood the world, lose everything to what turned out to be an elaborate deception? The answer is both simple and terrifying. Love makes us blind, and desperation makes us stupid. David never imagined that at 54 years old, sitting in his attorney's office in downtown Portland, he would be hearing these words. The beautiful ceremony he remembered so vividly, the flowers, the traditional music, the joy in his bride's eyes, it was all theater, an expensive, life-destroying performance that cost him everything he had worked for over 3 decades. If you're watching this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. These real-life stories need to be told, and your support helps us continue sharing these important warnings with people who might be walking into similar traps. But let's start from the beginning, because David's story didn't begin with that devastating phone call from his lawyer. It began 2 years earlier with grief, loneliness, and a heart desperate to love again. David Martinez had always been what people called a good man. He worked hard, paid his taxes, coached his son's baseball team, and loved his wife Margaret with the kind of steady, reliable affection that lasts decades. They met in college, married young, and built what seemed like the perfect middle-class American life in their suburban Portland home. Margaret was a teacher, David ran a small but successful business consulting firm, and their 2 children, Jessica and Michael, grew up wanting for nothing. Then Margaret got sick. Pancreatic cancer, the doctors said. 6 months, maybe 8 if they were lucky. David watched the woman he loved for 26 years disappear before his eyes, fought beside her through chemotherapy, held her hand through the dark nights when the pain was unbearable, and was there when she took her last breath on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. The funeral was everything Margaret would have wanted. Simple, dignified, surrounded by family and friends. But after everyone went home, after the casseroles stopped coming, after the sympathy cards stopped filling his mailbox, David found himself alone in a house that felt like a museum of memories he couldn't bear to face. Jessica was in graduate school in California, pursuing her PhD in psychology. Michael had just started his career as a software engineer in Seattle. They called regularly, visited when they could, but they had their own lives to build. David understood this, even encouraged it, but understanding didn't make the silence any less deafening. For 8 months, David went through the motions of living. He kept his business running, though his heart wasn't in it anymore. He ate dinner alone every night at the kitchen table where he and Margaret had shared thousands of meals. He slept on his side of their king-size bed, leaving Margaret's side untouched, her pillow still holding the faint scent of her perfume. His friends tried to help. They invited him to barbecues, tried to set him up with recently divorced women from their social circles, suggested he travel or take up new hobbies. But David felt like he was walking through life wearing a heavy coat of grief that nothing could remove. He wasn't ready to move on, wasn't sure he ever would be. It was his daughter Jessica who finally pushed him toward what would become the most dangerous decision of his life. During one of their Sunday phone calls, she said something that cut through his numbness like a knife. "Dad, Mom wouldn't want you to stop living. She'd want you to find happiness again. Maybe not the same kind of happiness, but something. You're only 52. You could have 20 or 30 more years ahead of you. Don't waste them mourning." Those words stayed with him for weeks. Slowly, very slowly, David began to consider the possibility that maybe Jessica was right. Maybe there was life after Margaret. Maybe he could find some form of companionship, if not love, then at least someone to share meals with, to talk to in the evenings, to help fill the enormous space Margaret's absence had created in his world. David's first tentative step back into the world of human connection came through an unexpected source: his business. He had always specialized in helping small companies streamline their operations, but as the world became increasingly digital, he found himself working with more international clients. One of these was a small import business run by a Thai-American woman named Lila Sutarak. Lila was 41, beautiful in a way that seemed almost ethereal to David. She had moved to the United States 15 years earlier to attend university, married an American man who turned out to be abusive, divorced, and was now successfully running her own business importing handcrafted goods from Southeast Asia. She was smart, articulate, and when she smiled, David felt something he thought had died with Margaret stir back to life. Their relationship began professionally. Lila needed help organizing her inventory systems and streamlining her supplier relationships. David found himself looking forward to their weekly meetings in ways that had nothing to do with business. She listened to his suggestions with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions, and slowly began sharing pieces of her own story. She told him about growing up in a poor village outside Bangkok, about watching her parents struggle to provide for their 5 children, about the scholarship that brought her to America and the dreams that kept her going through difficult times. She spoke about her ex-husband's cruelty with a quiet strength that David found both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I learned that sometimes the people who promise to love you can be the ones who hurt you most," she said during one of their meetings, her dark eyes holding a sadness that resonated deeply with David's own pain. "But I also learned that you cannot let fear stop you from hoping for something better." 3 months into their business relationship, David found himself thinking about Lila constantly. She was everything Margaret hadn't been: exotic, mysterious, slightly dangerous in the way that people who have survived real hardship often are. Where Margaret had been solid and predictable, Lila was fluid and surprising. Where Margaret had been comfortable and familiar, Lila was exciting and new. The transition from business to personal happened gradually, then suddenly. A dinner meeting that lasted until midnight. A weekend consultation that turned into a day exploring Portland's food scene. Long phone calls that had nothing to do with inventory management and everything to do with the growing connection between two people who had both known loss and were ready to risk loving again. Lila was different from anyone David had ever been with. She was passionate about everything: her business, her culture, her beliefs about family and loyalty, and the importance of never forgetting where you came from. She cooked elaborate Thai meals in his kitchen, filling the house with smells and sounds that were completely foreign but somehow felt like home. She talked about taking him to Thailand to meet her family, to see the temples and markets and beaches of her childhood. But even in those early intoxicating days, there were small things that bothered David. Little inconsistencies in her stories. The way she sometimes seemed to be performing emotions rather than feeling them. The fact that despite claiming to be close to her family, she never seemed to video call them or receive calls from them. The way she deflected whenever he asked specific questions about her business's financials or her plans for the future. David told himself these were cultural differences, or perhaps the natural guardedness of someone who had been hurt before. He was so hungry for connection, so grateful to feel alive again, that he ignored the small voice in his head that whispered warnings he wasn't ready to hear. 6 months after their first business meeting, David and Lila were inseparable. She had essentially moved into his house, though she maintained her own apartment for appearances. David had never experienced anything like the intensity of their relationship. Where his marriage to Margaret had been built on shared history and comfortable companionship, his relationship with Lila was pure fire. She made him feel young again, vital, important. She hung on his words when he talked about his business, sought his advice on everything from her wardrobe to her investment decisions. She told him he was the smartest, most generous man she had ever met, that meeting him had restored her faith in love, that she had never imagined she could feel so safe and cherished with another person. David had never been the kind of man who craved dramatic romance. His relationship with Margaret had been built on steady affection and shared goals. But with Lila, he found himself swept up in something that felt like a movie, She left love notes in his briefcase, surprised him with elaborate home-cooked meals when he returned from business trips, and talked about their future together with a certainty that both thrilled and slightly unnerved him. The first real warning sign came when Lila asked to borrow money. It was $10,000, she said, to help her expand her business. One of her suppliers in Thailand was offering her an exclusive deal on a new line of handcrafted jewelry, but she needed to pay up front to secure the contract. She showed him photographs of beautiful pieces, talked excitedly about the profit potential, promised to pay him back within 6 months with interest. David's business instincts told him to ask for documentation, to see contracts and financial projections. But when he looked into Lila's trusting eyes, when she told him how much his belief in her meant, when she kissed him and whispered that she had never had a partner who truly supported her dreams, he found himself writing the check without asking any of the questions he would have demanded of any other client. The second warning sign came when she started pushing for them to get married. Not just married, but married in Thailand, surrounded by her family, in a traditional Buddhist ceremony that would honor her heritage and give their union the proper spiritual foundation. She painted pictures of a beautiful outdoor ceremony in her village, of his children flying in to meet her extended family, of a honeymoon touring the temples and beaches of Southeast Asia. David found himself caught up in her enthusiasm. The idea of starting completely fresh, of having a wedding that was nothing like his first marriage, of beginning this new chapter of his life with such a dramatic gesture, appealed to something in him that he hadn't known existed. His children were initially skeptical. It seemed too fast, too exotic, too different from the father they thought they knew. But when they met Lila, when they saw how happy David seemed, they gave their reluctant blessing. The third warning sign was how quickly Lila began integrating herself into David's financial life. She started coming with him to meet with his accountant, asking detailed questions about his retirement investments, suggesting ways they could combine their resources to maximize their earning potential. She convinced him to add her name to his checking account for convenience since she was doing more and more of the household shopping and bill paying. She suggested they refinance his house to access some of the equity for shared investments in her business expansion. Each individual request seemed reasonable, even sweet. She was thinking about their future together, planning for the life they would build. David had always been generous with Margaret, and it felt natural to be generous with Lila. Besides, she was contributing to their household in other ways, cooking, cleaning, managing his social calendar, providing the kind of emotional support he desperately needed. But looking back, David would realize that each financial entanglement was another thread in a web that was slowly but systematically being woven around him. Lila was always careful to frame her requests in terms of their shared future, their mutual benefit, her desire to be a true partner rather than a dependent. She never demanded, never pressured, just made suggestions that seemed so logical and loving that refusing them would have felt selfish and suspicious. By the time they boarded the plane to Bangkok for their wedding, David had given Lila access to most of his liquid assets and had refinanced his house to free up an additional $100,000 for their shared business ventures. He told himself he was being romantic, generous, trusting in the way that real love required. He had no idea he was walking into the most carefully constructed trap of his life. The wedding in Thailand was everything Lila had promised and more. David found himself in a country that felt like a beautiful alien world, surrounded by Lila's family who welcomed him with warmth that seemed genuine and touching. Her parents were humble farmers who spoke limited English but communicated their gratitude and joy through smiles and gestures. Her siblings treated him like the brother they had always hoped for. The entire village seemed to celebrate their union with authentic happiness. The ceremony itself took place in a temple that was 600 years old, surrounded by monks chanting in a language David didn't understand but found deeply moving. Lila looked radiant in traditional Thai dress, and when she looked into his eyes during the exchange of vows, David felt certain he had made the right choice. This was real love, deep love, the kind of love that transcended cultural differences and age gaps and all the practical concerns his friends and children had raised. The weeks following the wedding were like a honeymoon that never ended. Lila took him to hidden beaches and mountain temples, introduced him to foods and experiences he never could have imagined. She was the perfect guide, translator, and companion. David felt like he was not just visiting Thailand, but being inducted into a new family, a new way of life, a new version of himself. But even during those magical weeks, David began to notice things that troubled him. Lila's family, while warm and welcoming, seemed unusually focused on his financial situation. They asked detailed questions about his business, his house, his plans for the future. They talked frequently about opportunities for investment in local businesses, about the potential for Americans to make significant money in Southeast Asian markets. Lila explained that her family was just being practical, that in Thai culture, financial planning was considered a family responsibility. She said her parents were worried about their future security and were hoping David's business expertise could help them make better decisions about their small farm and the money their children sent home from America. David wanted to be understanding, wanted to embrace this new culture and way of thinking, but his business instincts kept nagging at him. There was something too coordinated about these conversations, something that felt rehearsed about the way different family members brought up similar topics. The biggest red flag came when Lila's brother approached him with an investment opportunity. There was a piece of land near their village that was about to be developed into a resort. If David could invest $50,000 now, the brother claimed, he could potentially triple his money within 2 years. The opportunity was only available to family members, and it had to be secured before they returned to America. When David expressed hesitation, Lila became hurt and disappointed. She said she understood that trusting her family was difficult, but she had hoped that marrying her meant accepting her loved ones as his own. She cried genuine tears as she told him how embarrassed she felt that her new husband didn't trust her family's business judgment. David found himself in an impossible position. Every practical instinct told him the investment was suspicious, but he was in a foreign country, dependent on Lila for translation and cultural interpretation, surrounded by people who had welcomed him as family. Refusing the investment felt like rejecting not just a business opportunity, but his new wife's entire support system. In the end, he agreed to invest $30,000. It seemed like a compromise that honored both his caution and his commitment to his new family. Lila was overjoyed, her family was grateful, and David told himself he was learning to trust in the way that marriage required. It was only after they returned to Portland that David began to understand how completely he had been manipulated. The withdrawal from his accounts had been larger than expected, $45,000 instead of $30,000. When he questioned Lila about it, she explained that there had been additional fees and taxes that had to be paid immediately to secure the deal. She showed him paperwork in Thai that she said documented the investment, but David had no way to verify its authenticity. More troubling was what happened to their joint account. David discovered that while he was sleeping off jet lag during their first week back, Lila had transferred significant amounts of money to various accounts she claimed were related to her business expansion. When he asked for explanations, she became defensive and hurt, saying she couldn't believe he was already questioning her financial decisions after everything they had shared. David found himself walking on eggshells in his own house. Every question about money was treated as a personal attack. Every expression of concern was framed as evidence that he didn't truly trust or love her. Lila had become skilled at turning his reasonable business caution into evidence of his failure as a husband. But the most devastating blow was still to come. 3 months after their return from Thailand, David's accountant called with news that would begin the complete unraveling of his life. The IRS was investigating his accounts for suspicious international transfers. Several large withdrawals had been flagged as potential money laundering. And most shocking of all, there was no record of any legal marriage between David Martinez and Lila Sudarak. The phone call from his accountant felt like a physical blow. David sat in his office, staring out at the Portland skyline he had looked at thousands of times before, while the man he had trusted with his finances for 15 years delivered news that made no sense. "David, I need you to come in immediately. There are some irregularities in your accounts that we need to discuss, and I need to ask you about this marriage you mentioned. According to the State Department, there's no record of any legal ceremony between you and Ms. Sutterak. The documents you showed me appear to be ceremonial only. If you're watching this story and wondering how someone could be so thoroughly deceived, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Have you or anyone you know ever experienced anything similar? These stories are more common than people realize, and sharing them helps protect others from similar situations. David's first instinct was denial. He had been there, had participated in what felt like a completely legitimate ceremony. He had the photographs, the certificate, the memories of monks and families, and legal-looking paperwork. But as his accountant walked him through the documentation, the terrible truth became undeniable. The ceremony in Thailand had been real, but it was purely religious, with no legal standing in either Thailand or the United States. For the marriage to be legally recognized, additional paperwork would have needed to be filed with both governments, a process that could take months and required extensive documentation that had never been provided. More devastating was what the financial investigation revealed. Over the 8 months since they had been together, David had lost nearly $200,000. Some of it had been withdrawn as cash, some had been transferred to accounts in Thailand and other countries, and some had been invested in businesses that appeared to exist only on paper. The investment in the Thailand development was completely fictitious. The business expansion loans had gone to companies that had no actual operations. The shared checking account had been systematically drained to fund transfers to accounts David had never known existed. But perhaps the most crushing revelation was about Lila herself. The private investigator David hired discovered that Lila Sutterak was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Siraporn Chayadej, and she was part of an organized group that specialized in romance scams targeting widowed or divorced American men. The beautiful story of her scholarship to America, her abusive marriage, her struggle to build a business, all of it was fiction, carefully crafted to appeal to David's desire to rescue and protect someone who had survived hardship. Her family in Thailand were actors, paid to perform the role of grateful relatives welcoming a generous American son-in-law. David learned that he was not Siraporn's first victim. Over the previous 5 years, she had conducted similar relationships with at least 3 other men, each time using slight variations of the same story, the same gradual financial manipulation, the same fake wedding ceremony. The private investigator estimated that her total theft from American victims exceeded $500,000. The house David had lived in for 20 years, the house where he had raised his children and cared for Margaret through her final illness, was now mortgaged to the point where he owed more than it was worth. His retirement accounts had been decimated. His business was struggling because he had been so distracted by his relationship that he had neglected his clients. Most devastating of all was the emotional toll. David had believed he was building a new life based on love and trust. Instead, he had been the target of a carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise. Every moment of intimacy, every expression of love, every shared dream had been a performance designed to separate him from his money. The woman he had fallen in love with had never existed. Lila, with her sad stories and hopeful dreams and passionate declarations of love, was a character created specifically to exploit his loneliness and generosity. The real Siraporn was a predator who had studied his vulnerabilities with the precision of a scientist and had manipulated them with the skill of a professional actress. When David confronted Siraporn with the evidence his private investigator had uncovered, her response was swift and terrifying. Gone was the loving, vulnerable woman he thought he had married. In her place was someone cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. "You cannot prove anything," she said, her accent suddenly sharper, her English more precise than it had ever been during their relationship. "Try to make trouble for me, and you will discover what real trouble looks like." The threats began immediately. Siraporn claimed to have recorded conversations in which David had discussed tax avoidance strategies. She said she had photographs and videos that would embarrass him if they became public. She hinted that she had connections to people who could make his life very difficult if he attempted to involve law enforcement. Most chilling of all was her detailed knowledge of his children's lives. She knew Jessica's university address, Michael's workplace, their daily routines and social media activity. The implication was clear. If David caused problems for her, the consequences might extend beyond him to the people he loved most. David found himself trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no exit. He couldn't go to the police because most of the money had been given voluntarily, and the fake marriage, while morally fraudulent, might not constitute criminal fraud in the eyes of the law. He couldn't simply cut contact with Siriporn because she was still living in his house and had legal access to his accounts. The psychological warfare was relentless. Siriporn alternated between threats and manipulation, sometimes returning to her Lila persona to remind David of their love and convince him that they could work through their problems if he would just trust her. Other times she was openly hostile, treating him like an ATM that had temporarily malfunctioned but could be fixed with the right combination of pressure and persuasion. She brought friends to the house, other Thai women who seemed to be evaluating David's remaining assets while pretending to offer marriage counseling. She talked openly on the phone in Thai, laughing in ways that made David certain he was the subject of their conversations. She began staying out all night without explanation, then returning to act as if nothing had happened. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. David felt he couldn't tell his children what was happening because he was ashamed of his gullibility and afraid of putting them in danger. His friends had warned him about moving too fast with Lila, and he couldn't bear their "I told you so" reactions. His business relationships were suffering because he was constantly distracted and anxious. David began to understand how people could be driven to desperate measures by this kind of systematic psychological abuse. He fantasized about simply disappearing, about liquidating whatever assets remained and starting over somewhere far away. He researched witness protection programs and international relocation services. He even considered more permanent solutions to what felt like an impossible situation. The turning point came when Siriporn overplayed her hand. She demanded that David sign over the deed to his house, claiming it was necessary to protect their shared assets from the IRS investigation. When he refused, she became violent for the first time, throwing dishes and screaming threats that were clearly heard by his neighbors. That night, David lay awake staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he had shared with Margaret, then with the woman he thought was Lila, and realized that he had a choice to make. He could continue to be a victim, or he could find the courage to fight back, regardless of the consequences. David's salvation came from an unexpected source, his late wife's sister, Patricia. She had been calling regularly since Margaret's death, checking on David's well-being with the persistent concern of someone who had loved Margaret deeply and felt responsible for the people Margaret had left behind. When Patricia called during one of Siriporn's overnight absences, David finally broke down and told her everything. The shame he had expected to feel was overwhelmed by relief at finally having someone to share the burden of his situation. Patricia's response was immediate and practical. She was a retired police detective who had spent 30 years dealing with criminals and con artists. Instead of judgment or pity, she offered expertise and support. David, you're not the first good person to be targeted by professionals. These people are criminals, and they're very good at what they do, but they're not invincible, and you're not helpless. We're going to get you out of this, but we need to be smart about it. Patricia helped David understand that he was dealing with an organized crime operation, not just an individual scammer. The threats against his children were likely empty, designed to keep him paralyzed and compliant. The recordings and photographs Siriporn claimed to have were probably fictitious, more tools of psychological manipulation. Together, they developed a plan that would allow David to regain control of his situation while minimizing the risks to himself and his family. The first step was documenting everything. David began secretly recording conversations with Siriporn, photographing documents, and keeping detailed logs of threats and financial transactions. The second step was securing his remaining assets. Working with his accountant and Patricia's law enforcement contacts, David began the process of freezing accounts, changing passwords, and establishing legal barriers that would prevent further theft. The third and most difficult step was the confrontation itself. Patricia helped David understand that he needed to stop acting like a victim and start acting like someone who was fighting back. This meant refusing Siraporn's demands, challenging her threats, and making it clear that the easy exploitation was over. When Siraporn returned home after 3 days away, she found a very different David waiting for her. He had changed the locks on the house. Her belongings were packed and waiting by the door, and he had legal documents requiring her to vacate the premises immediately. Siraporn's fury was spectacular and terrifying. She screamed, threatened, pleaded, and tried every manipulation technique that had worked before. But David, supported by Patricia's presence and armed with legal documentation of her fraud, stood firm. "I know who you really are, Siraporn. I know about the other men you've victimized. I have evidence of your criminal activity, and I'm prepared to use it. You can leave peacefully now, or you can leave in handcuffs, but you are leaving." The moment when Siraporn finally walked out of David's house was both triumphant and anticlimactic. He had expected to feel joy or relief, but instead he felt mostly exhaustion. The woman who had dominated his life for nearly a year was gone, but the damage she had caused would take much longer to repair. Patricia stayed with David for the next week, helping him secure his home, change his routines, and begin the long process of rebuilding his life. She also helped him understand that his healing would require more than just removing Siraporn from his life. He needed to understand how he had become vulnerable to her manipulation in the first place. The months following Siraporn's departure were among the most difficult of David's life. The practical challenges were enormous: rebuilding his finances, restoring his business relationships, dealing with law enforcement and tax authorities. But the emotional challenges were even greater. David struggled with shame, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal that went beyond what Siraporn had done to him. He felt betrayed by his own judgment, his own instincts, his own capacity for love. How could someone who had successfully navigated business relationships for decades have been so completely fooled by a criminal? The answer he learned through therapy was that grief and loneliness had made him vulnerable in ways he hadn't understood. The death of a spouse creates a psychological wound that can take years to heal, and predators like Siraporn are experts at identifying and exploiting that vulnerability. David's therapist helped him understand that his desire to love again, to find companionship and intimacy after Margaret's death, was not foolish or wrong. What had been wrong was his rush to trust, his willingness to ignore warning signs because he was so desperate to believe that love was possible again. Rebuilding his relationship with his children was particularly challenging. Jessica and Michael were hurt that their father had hidden such a significant crisis from them, and they were angry that he had risked their inheritance and security for someone they had never fully trusted. But they were also compassionate enough to understand that their father had been targeted by professionals who specialized in exploiting people exactly like him. The financial recovery was slow and incomplete. David was able to recover some of the stolen money through insurance claims and civil litigation, but the majority was gone forever. He had to sell the house he had shared with Margaret, downsize his lifestyle significantly, and delay his retirement by at least 5 years. But perhaps the most important part of David's recovery was his decision to share his story publicly. Working with law enforcement, he helped build cases against Siraporn and her associates. Several other victims came forward after hearing David's story, and the investigation revealed a network of romance scammers operating across multiple states and countries. David also began speaking to groups of widowed and divorced people, sharing his experience as a warning and offering support to others who were navigating the dangers of late-life dating. He discovered that his story was tragically common, that thousands of Americans lose billions of dollars each year to romance scams targeting people who are grieving, lonely, or simply ready to love again. Through this work, David found a sense of purpose that helped transform his victimization into advocacy. He couldn't undo the damage Siraporn had caused, but he could help prevent others from suffering similar fates. He became an expert in recognizing the warning signs of romance scams and helped develop educational programs that could protect vulnerable people. Most importantly, David began to heal emotionally. The shame that had consumed him in the immediate aftermath of the scam slowly gave way to understanding and self-forgiveness. He learned to see himself not as a fool who had been easily deceived, but as a good person who had been targeted by criminals precisely because of his capacity for trust and generosity. 2 years after Siriporn walked out of his life, David Martinez sat in his modest apartment overlooking the Willamette River, reflecting on the journey that had taken him from successful businessman to crime victim to survivor and advocate. The view was different from his old house, smaller and less grand, but it was his, and it was safe. The most important lesson David learned was that love and vigilance are not mutually exclusive. His marriage to Margaret had taught him that real love grows slowly, built on shared experiences and proven trust. His experience with Siriporn had taught him that predators understand this and deliberately accelerate the timeline to prevent their victims from thinking clearly. David learned to recognize the warning signs that he had ignored in his desperation to love again. Love bombing, the excessive attention and affection that Siriporn had used to overwhelm his judgment. Financial entanglement, the gradual requests for money and access that had seemed reasonable individually but were devastating collectively. Isolation, the subtle ways Siriporn had separated him from his support network and made him dependent on her interpretation of reality. He also learned that recovery from this kind of victimization requires more than just practical steps. It requires rebuilding your sense of self-worth, your ability to trust your own judgment, and your faith that good people exist even though bad people also exist. This process cannot be rushed, and it requires professional help and community support. David's relationship with his children had ultimately grown stronger through the crisis. Jessica and Michael had learned to see their father not as an invulnerable authority figure, but as a human being capable of making mistakes and needing support. They had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining close family relationships as protection against predators who target isolated individuals. Most remarkably, David had not given up on the possibility of love. Through his advocacy work, he had met other survivors who had rebuilt their lives and found healthy relationships. He had learned that the goal was not to become cynical or closed off, but to become wise and careful. Love was still possible, but it had to be earned over time through consistent actions, not claimed through dramatic gestures and emotional manipulation. David's advice to anyone in a similar situation was simple but profound. Trust your instincts, maintain your independence, and never let anyone rush you into major financial or emotional commitments. Real love is patient and understanding. Real love doesn't demand immediate access to your resources or try to separate you from your support network. Real love grows stronger with time and scrutiny rather than weaker. To the viewers watching this story, David's message was clear. Romance scams are not rare aberrations perpetrated against unusually gullible people. They are sophisticated criminal enterprises that target normal, intelligent individuals during moments of vulnerability. Anyone can be a victim, but everyone can also be prepared. If you're currently dating after loss or divorce, please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Leave a comment about your own experiences or concerns. Share this story with friends who might be in vulnerable situations. The best defense against predators like Siriporn is an informed community that looks out for one another. David's story ended not with the fairy tale romance he had hoped for, but with something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that he could survive betrayal, rebuild his life, and help protect others from similar harm. He had learned that strength comes not from avoiding all risks, but from facing them with wisdom, preparation, and the support of people who truly care about your well-being. The wedding may have been fake, but the lessons David learned were real, and they would protect him for the rest of his life.